Welcome to the Bare Metal Cyber Series Prepcast. This series helps you prepare for the exam with focused explanations and practical context. A risk treatment plan defines the organization's specific strategy for addressing a known risk. In other words, it's the step-by-step plan that turns a risk decision into action. The chosen strategy, whether it's to accept, mitigate, transfer, or avoid the risk, must be supported by a documented series of steps. In other words, the decision must be followed by structured activity. These include specific assignments, timelines, monitoring checkpoints, and metrics for success. In other words, you can't manage what isn't tracked. A treatment plan is not optional. It is a core component of effective risk governance. In other words, every managed risk must have a defined action path. It provides visibility, enables review, and allows leadership to confirm that risk is being handled according to policy. In other words, it gives accountability a structure. On the C-Risk exam, the term treatment plan should signal a deliberate, documented, and actively monitored path toward reducing risk. In other words, it's not a concept, it's a concrete process. An effective treatment plan includes several essential components. In other words, it's made of required elements, not suggestions. It begins with a clear risk description and context. What is the risk? Where does it occur? And why does it matter? In other words, define the problem clearly. Next is the selected response strategy, including the rationale behind that choice. In other words, explain the why before the how. Then come the specific actions to be taken, such as control implementations, procedural changes, or insurance purchases. In other words, describe exactly what will happen. Owners must be named, including both the risk owner and control owner. In other words, assign responsibility to people, not roles. Teams responsible for implementation, monitoring, and validation should be assigned. In other words, define who acts and who reviews. Timelines, milestones, and budget estimates help structure the work. In other words, planning prevents delay. Finally, the plan must define what residual risk is expected after treatment and how success will be measured. In other words, end goals must be written in advance. This entire structure must be auditable and reviewable. In other words, others must be able to verify decisions. C-Risk questions often focus on whether these pieces are present, especially the owners, metrics, and schedule. In other words, completeness is tested often. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other podcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Every treatment plan must align with the organization's stated risk appetite and tolerance. In other words, risk responses must fit the limits defined by leadership. The end result of treatment should be residual risk that is acceptable to leadership. In other words, success means being inside the risk boundary. Over-treating risk, spending more resources than the risk justifies, is inefficient and unsustainable. In other words, too much control is wasteful. Undertreating leaves exposure that may violate policy or create audit findings. In other words, too little treatment leads to failure. Prioritization must reflect risk severity, likelihood, and the business value of the asset at risk. In other words, context drives sequencing. Plans should be reviewed to confirm that risk levels after treatment fall within tolerated boundaries. In other words, validation must be tied to tolerance thresholds. In exam questions, if residual risk is still above tolerance after implementation, the treatment must be revisited or expanded. In other words, success is defined by results, not effort. Good answers reflect alignment with strategy, not just technical action. In other words, policy always sets the target. Sequencing and phasing are essential when treatment includes multiple steps, teams, or systems. In other words, timing must be managed as carefully as content. Some controls cannot be implemented until others are in place. For example, monitoring won't work if logging hasn't been enabled. In other words, order matters. High complexity treatment may need to be phased across departments, systems, or quarters. In other words, scale affects timeline. Quick wins should be implemented early, while high-cost or resource-intensive actions are planned for later. In other words, deliver early value and reserve resources for long-term work. Include checkpoints at logical milestones to assess whether the treatment is working and whether any part needs adjustment. In other words, track as you go. Buffer periods between phases allow the team to detect and correct unexpected issues. In other words, build time for surprises. On the C-risk exam, look for clues about sequencing gaps, when a control was implemented before prerequisites were ready or without enough time to observe effects. In other words, identify when order disrupted effectiveness. Effective treatment planning requires broad stakeholder involvement. In other words, risk planning is not a solo task. Risk owners are responsible for overall direction, but control owners execute specific components. In other words, governance defines vision and operations make it real. Executives or governance committees may be required to approve the plan. In other words, oversight ensures accountability. Include representatives from compliance, legal, finance, IT, and business units. In other words, cross-sectional engagement prevents gaps. Identify dependencies early. Cross-sectional blockers are easier to avoid when expectations are aligned. In other words, talk early to move smoothly. Communicate the plan clearly, including what changes are coming, what resources are needed, and what success looks like. In other words, visibility reduces resistance. On the exam, strong answers involve collaborative planning, visible ownership, and documented alignment. In other words, good governance shows up in teamwork. A treatment plan cannot succeed without resources. In other words, funding and staffing drive results. Funding must be confirmed in advance, especially for high-impact controls. In other words, cost must be addressed before execution, personnel must be assigned, and tooling requirements must be documented. In other words, human and technical needs must be planned together. Every resource request should include justification, what the risk is, what treatment costs, and what value is being protected. In other words, connect cost to consequence. Governance bodies may request comparisons, such as whether insurance is more cost-effective than a control. In other words, alternatives must be considered. If funding is delayed, treatment may stall, and risk will remain unmanaged. In other words, planning failure equals risk exposure. C-risk questions often present scenarios where treatment failed due to missing resources. In other words, a good answer starts with planning. Good answers include planning, justification, and coordination, not assumptions. In other words, structure wins. Once treatment is underway, progress must be monitored. In other words, deployment must be tracked in real time. Use dashboards, GRC systems, or project trackers to follow deadlines and milestones. In other words, visibility tools enable control. Track performance against targets. Are controls implemented, tested, and functioning? In other words, measure against benchmarks. If the risk environment changes, such as a new threat or a regulatory shift, the plan may need to be adjusted. In other words, treatment plans must remain dynamic. Regular reports should be shared with stakeholders. In other words, communication sustains alignment. In C-risk scenarios, missed updates often reflect weak risk lifecycle management. In other words, gaps in reporting point to governance flaws. Good answers include active tracking, stakeholder updates, and dynamic adjustments. In other words, responsiveness matters. Documentation is part of governance. In other words, if it isn't recorded, it doesn't exist. Update the risk register with current treatment status and future review date. In other words, keep records current. Record assumptions, approvals, milestones, and completion evidence. In other words, every step must leave a trail. Keep audit trails for who approved each step, who executed it, and when. In other words, traceability supports assurance. Plan review should be triggered by schedule or by events such as incidents or audit findings. In other words, validation must be time-based or need-based. C-risk professionals must ensure traceability so decisions and actions can be reviewed and improved. In other words, transparency leads to trust. Treatment outcomes must be validated before the cycle is closed. In other words, never assume success. Was the risk reduced? Are controls working? Are indicators within acceptable range? In other words, measure before declaring victory. This may require simulations, retesting, or review of post-implementation monitoring data. In other words, evidence comes from action. If success is confirmed, the risk register should be updated, and the plan can be marked complete. In other words, closure is tied to confirmation. If not, additional treatment may be needed. In other words, the cycle continues until results are real. Strong answers include confirmation of effectiveness, not just execution of tasks. In other words, proof, not intention. Ends the process. E-risk exam questions about treatment plans are highly practical. In other words, they test planning and execution, not theory. You may be asked which part is missing, why a plan failed, or what should be done next. In other words, apply structure to solve problems. Common gaps include missing ownership, unclear timelines, or failure to validate. In other words, oversight flaws appear in missed elements. You may also need to measure treatment success. This usually involves confirming residual risk is now within tolerance. In other words, results must meet governance goals. Good answers show structure, alignment, and accountability, not vague promises or undocumented effort. In other words, maturity is shown through planning and follow-through. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Bare Metal Cybersecurity Risk Prepcast. For more episodes, tools, and study support, visit us at baremetalcyber.com.